BRICS Summit, of course, enters its second day this morning, and high on the agenda will be the expansion of the bloc. Now, at least 20 countries have formally applied to join, but political analyst Patrick Bond, he says that things have not been going well for the grouping. He joins me now to explain exactly what he means by that. Thank you so much, Prof. Bond, for joining me this morning. Of course, you know, there's been a lot of talk about BRICS, and all eyes are on South Africa. The world's watching, and of course, there's a lot to discuss. But first and foremost, let's just get your general opinion from what you've seen so far, and what can we expect from this meeting?
Oh, it's up and down, right? It's a schizophrenic situation. And just to say on the last report on the Chinese supply of especially renewable energy resources, it's fantastic. I spent last week in northern China, Yinqiang, at an academic conference, and you could just see the rollout of the solar and the wind in a very underdeveloped area near the Mongolia border. And it's really impressive. The other thing that the Chinese have done to drive our own transition is when 2 years ago, if you may recall, Xi Jinping, the president, said that he would no longer support coal-fired power plants on the Belt and Road. What that did was to kill the Messina-Mikado Special Economic Zone's 4,600 megawatt coal-fired power plant. That was the original proposal, nearly as big as Kusile and Medupe. Now that's the sort of pressure we're seeing the debates about. The West is putting pressure to decarbonize, and that includes a carrot, giving some $8.5 billion. But what Xi did, I think, is laudable. He used a stick. He said, we're just not going to have any more coal-fired power in our Belt and Road. He put on a sort of financial sanctions. And I think it's that mix of kind of giving something, the cheaper renewable. What we'd hope is that renewable would come without intellectual property restrictions. So South Africa could start a major renewable industry since we have so much sun and wind. But yeah, more generally, it's a mixed bag. The big news yesterday was a retreat from the De-dollarization initiative. And that was what Sim Tshabalala, the Standard Bank CEO, 20% owned, by the way, by the Chinese state. And that bank had been expected to become more ambitious, especially as a renewed international reform of currencies, monetary systems, and finance has been under discussion. However, what Tshabalala, backed by the finance minister, Godongwana, said was that we're just not ready. And I think that's true. I kind of predicted that there was too much hype about the de-dollarization, and indeed even about having a BRICS currency, and about including the sharing of local trade-related currencies where there's terrible imbalances. Russia and India having probably some of the most severe, which means with exchange controls on the rupee, the Indian currency, and also on the renminbi in China, it's very hard to get your money out if you, as Russia does with India, if you have a trade surplus. So there's extremely important constraints in the real economy that prevent the BRICS from moving forward with this financial reform. And so that's one of the ways I think this schizophrenia is playing out, kind of an anti-imperialism in rhetoric, but now acknowledgement, certainly in the financial area, that there's a sub-imperial, a relationship to the dollar that can't be broken. It's a shame because the dollar is so much a subject of abuse by the Federal Reserve in tightening too much the last year and a half, but having loosened to bail out its own banks and financial deregulatory processes. So we'd like to see much more, but we're not really in the stage.
Professor Bond, I think when we talk about the de-dollarization, and that's a big topic, of course, that's been discussed. And, you mentioned, and sometimes it is more expensive, when you take a look at infrastructure project, for example, it is cheaper, to use a dollar-based system instead of, working with local currencies, or a BRICS currency is also, not really something that is realistic at the moment, as you just mentioned. But then what will be discussed, do you think, by the BRICS nations? Because this is going to be a topic of discussion as to how they can do trade in their own currencies without having a dollar-backed system. So I know you mentioned the cons, but aren't there, some sort of a pros here as well when it comes to this?
Oh, yes. We definitely need local currency. I mean, there's so much that is required in infrastructure, for example, in this country, that is locally produced. We don't need to import a great deal of the labor or of the raw materials, the material inputs to big infrastructure projects. And so it was interesting yesterday, another project from the BRICS, the New Development Bank, lending to Transnet. There may be 18 billion rand for getting locomotives. And the terrible tragedy with, if you remember, the Guptas had corrupted the huge deal with China South Rail, and it led to convictions or prosecutions, not yet convictions, of Brian Molefe and Sebonga Gama. And this was over coal-bearing locomotives that would go from as far as Lepalale on the border of Botswana all the way to Richards Bay. And they were so full of corruption, and the South African Revenue Service attacked China South Rail for not paying its bill, and Pravin Gordhan went to China. And what I'm trying to get at is how we really are wasting so much time with these international deals, and we should be doing much more local. And I think we should be questioning whether coal exports 18 billion rand more of loans from the New Development Bank is appropriate in a climate-constrained world. But I do think, yes, if Dilma Rousseff, the head of the BRICS Bank, says by 2030 we'll go to 30% of the asset base of that bank would be in local currencies. And then you'd ask, well, what interest rate do we pay? And we've just seen the first rand denominated loan for the BRICS coming in. Well, it's not the first loan from the BRICS, the first time the BRICS have raised money. And that came in at about 12.75%. It would be much cheaper in dollars, but then the factor of our currency falling means it's probably still cheaper at that very high interest rate. And I think those are the calculations, and we'd much rather see Dilma Rousseff speed that up, wouldn't we, to have much higher local currency, because it's mostly local currency needed for these projects. It's not imported goods for many of our desperately needed infrastructure improvements.
It is quite unfortunate that we don't have any more time, Professor Bond, because I would have liked to talk about what the Finance Minister yesterday also mentioned about, there is a trade imbalance basically with us and China. So hopefully that gap will be closed somehow, and not just South Africa exporting raw materials, but also us exporting the finished product from South Africa as well. Well, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully we can chat on a different day as well. Professor Patrick Bond, a political analyst, of course, just explaining what a BRICS currency could potentially mean, if that is something that will be discussed at this BRICS summit, and just how trade generally would work between these BRICS nations. Of course, we know that when it comes to the world global economy, that the BRICS countries now contribute 32% of that global economy. That is more, 2% more than what, of course, the G7 countries are contributing at the moment. So it's not that it is a competition, but it just shows that there is a lot of economic possibilities.